Checking Out My History by John Agard was first published in 2004 in the collection Half Caste and Other Poems. These explore themes of race, cultural identity, and the tensions that these can bring about. Agard was born in British Guyana in 1949. On the northern coast of mainland South America, it has been known as the Cooperative Republic of Guyana since 1966, when it achieved its independence after more than 150 years of British colonial rule. The official language of Guyana is English, although the majority of its population speak Guyanese Creole, which is based on English, as a first language. Agard moved to Britain in 1977 with his partner, the Guyanese poet Grace Nichols, where he has lived ever since. In the poem, the speaker juxtaposes the type of history that he was taught at school in his country while it was under colonial rule, with the Afro-Caribbean history that was deliberately omitted from the curriculum. I use the term history in the former case very loosely, as the bulk of it seems to comprise not only remote English and European history, but also English folklore and legend, and English nursery rhymes, none of which has any cultural or historical significance for children in Guyana. In an interview available on the BBC Teach YouTube channel, Agard says that the retelling of history depends a lot upon who is telling the story. And he recalls, "The first line in our history book was, 'West Indian history begins in 1492 with the arrival of Columbus.'" He goes on to explain that it's that very Eurocentric view. Nothing exists until the European has entered the arena. The history learnt in colonial schools is the history of the colonizers and not the colonized. It teaches only about the power and the might of the colonizers and that the subjugated should accept their oppression. He feels that he has missed out on learning not only about inspirational Afro-Caribbean figures, such as Toussaint Louverture, who actually had very significant impacts on the course of history, but also about the massacre and oppression of indigenous peoples, such as the Caribs and the Arawaks. It's not difficult to see why the colonizers wished to keep their Afro-Caribbean subjects ignorant of historical figures who rebelled against oppression and won. The poem explores the way in which cultural identity is formed through an understanding of our own history, and that its deliberate omission can be seen as a form of cultural and political oppression. The poem is a monologue. It is written in free verse and has 10 stanzas varying in length from 2 lines to 12 lines. As well as stanza lengths, line lengths are also irregular, varying between 2 syllables and 14 syllables. There are differences in the way the stanzas dealing with the history of the speaker was taught as a child, and those dealing with the history he is learning now are set out on the page. Agard describes these 2 different types of history as a counterpoint of 2 voices, where one voice is the nursery rhymes, counterpointed by a celebration of historical characters. The nursery rhymes voice is written in normal font, while the stanzas celebrating the historical characters he is learning about by himself not only are written in italic font, but are also indented. Overall, the lines written in normal font tend to be longer than those in italics, which, in contrast, come across as punchy and full of energy. There is no fixed rhyme scheme. Agard does, however, make use, although not consistently, of end rhyme, particularly in the stanzas written in normal font. Most rhymes are masculine in that the rhymes are between final stress syllables, and these tend to follow an A pattern. This helps to give these stanzas a monotonous cadence and suggests the formulaic and dry nature of what he has been taught. A performance of the poem by John Agard is available on the Poetry Archive website at the following address: and is well worth listening to more than once in order to pick up the intended cadences and intonation. The poem is very rhythmic, and sections of it, those detailing the history he was taught at school, are almost sung, while those detailing the history which is part of his identity are expressed with much more seriousness and energy. There's no punctuation, such as commas and full stops at all, which not only adds to the song-like quality of the poem, but also, through the consequent enjambment of every single line, creates a momentum which communicates not only the speaker's frustration at the irrelevant and inconsequential history that he is taught, in the lines written in normal font, but also the energy and empowerment he feels in the discovery of history that is pertinent to him, in the lines written in italic font. The lack of punctuation might also be seen as a rejection of the formal European style of writing he has been taught, in order to embrace the oral traditions of his own culture. The poet uses simple vocabulary, especially in the stanzas written in normal font, suggesting the childish and essentially trivial nature of the ideas that have been taught him by rote. There is little figurative language in the poem, but what there is, for example, metaphor, kennings, and powerful verbs, is restricted to the stanzas written in italics, making them come alive and suggesting the creative power and freedom that the speaker feels is unleashed when you learn something which strikes a chord deep within you. The poem is written in a non-standard English Caribbean dialect, and spelling is sometimes phonetic, or spelt as it is pronounced, in order to evoke the accent and speech patterns of a person from the Caribbean. The word dem is used for they. Thee is often, although not always, rendered as dee, and that as dat. My, his, and her are rendered as me, he, and she. Most regular past tenses of verbs are often missing their usual ed ending. For example, the verb discover would be rendered discovered in standard English. This gives the poem a sense of immediacy, even though it is not written in the present tense, emphasising the idea that this history is important in the here and now. There is extensive anaphora throughout the poem of the key phrase "dem tell me," which introduces the sections listing to the reader the history that the speaker was taught as a child. The repetitive nature of this phrase helps communicate the speaker's frustration at the way in which he is bombarded with this information which is useless to him. There is also repetition of the phrase, "but dem never tell me about," which likewise emphasises the glaring omissions in what he has been taught. Words forming a semantic field of light are to be found in all the stanzas relating to Afro-Caribbean historical figures, e.g. beacon, fire, star, and sunrise, the antithesis of the metaphorical darkness imposed by those who used to teach him as they bandage up his eyes and blind him to his own history and identity. The poem starts, dem tell me what dem want to tell me. Repetition in immediate succession, seen here in the first two lines, is known as epizeuxis, and makes the words seem very forceful. We find out in the third line that they tell him what dem want to tell him. The identity of the dem is not specified, but we can infer that they are the teachers and, by extension, the authorities of the colonial powers under which he is living. The verb tell communicates his feeling that he is the passive recipient of knowledge, which has been deliberately curated and redacted, according to the needs of those in power to keep the population ignorant. There is no sense that he has been encouraged to be an active participant in the learning process. The second stanza stands out for being only 2 lines long. Education is usually intended to metaphorically open your eyes so that you see or understand, but he feels like the exact opposite has happened. His eye has been metaphorically bandaged up with his own history, and he has been blinded to his own identity. Note the plosive alliteration of bandage and blind, which communicates the power of his contempt, and the repetition of the word own, prefacing both history and identity. The use of the word own here communicates his feeling that the history he is being taught and the identity that is being forced upon him are not his own. There is another history and another identity out there that is his own, and that he is effectively being denied. The connection of history and identity, the two words prominently placed at the end of each line of this short stanza to enhance their rhyme, inextricably links them together. You can't have the one without the other. The anaphora, Dem tell me about, at the beginning of the third stanza, marks the establishment of the pattern that the poet will maintain for all stanzas written in normal font. The phrase 1066 and all that refers to the date of the Norman conquest of England, some 1,000 years ago, when Harold II was defeated by William the Conqueror. It may also refer to a humorous book by W. C. Seller and R. J. Yeatman, first published in 1930, entitled 1066 and All That, A Memorable History of England, comprising all the parts you can remember, including 103 good things, 5 bad kings, and 2 genuine dates, which is a tongue-in-cheek retelling of the history of England. Dick Whittington and He Cat is a reference to the legendary character, star of many a pantomime, who went from rags to riches to become the Lord Mayor of London, all the while accompanied by his trusty cat. The real historical figure, Richard Whittington, born in 1354, was never very poor, and there is no evidence that he had a cat at all. It's very likely that his life story was merged with a 14th century Persian folktale that was popular at the time. These allusions suggest that the history the speaker is being taught is superficial, not necessarily accurate. The final 2 lines of the third stanza introduces an Afro-Caribbean historical figure, this time Toussaint Louverture, whom them never tell me about. Toussaint Louverture, aka Toussaint Breda, was born into slavery in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now known as Haiti, in 1743. He became a free man in 1776 at the age of 33. He began his military career in 1791 when he headed the slave rebellion that was to lead to the Haitian Revolution, which overthrew French colonial rule. He adopted the surname Louverture in around 1792. The word is French for the one who opened the way, and is believed to refer to his ability to create openings in battle. Haiti became the world's first black-led republic and the first independent Caribbean state in 1804, a year after his death. In the fourth stanza, the speaker, his tone changing, outlines Louverture's importance. Although initially a slave, he had a vision or the ability to plan with both imagination and wisdom, and through this he was able to lick back Napoleon battalion. The verb lick back suggests power, ease and victory at a single stroke, thus belittling Napoleon's army, which had beaten mightier enemies, by implication. The consonants of the guttural k sound in lick back also seems to communicate the speaker's relishing of the very idea. The end of the stanza involves antithesis. Toussaint may have been a metaphorical thorn, a thorn in the side or a persistent annoyance of the French. But for the people of Haiti, he was the very opposite, instead a beacon of the Haitian Revolution. A beacon is a fire or a light set in a prominent high position as a warning or a celebration, suggesting his being in the vanguard of the forces that brought about self-determination and self-rule to the people of Haiti. The speaker resumes his sing-songy tone for the next stanza, as we learn that "Dem tell me about the man who discovered the balloon." We can only assume that he is referring to the 19th century English scientist Michael Faraday here, who invented rubber balloons. This all seems a bit random, but that is probably the point, especially as this is quickly followed by a reference to the nursery rhyme "Hey diddle diddle," and "a cow who jump over the moon." History, as taught him, appears to be a disparate collection of random facts and nursery rhymes which have no cohesive or coherent narrative, let alone personal relevance to him. The final two lines juxtapose the babyish "Dem tell me about the dish run away with the spoon," another reference to "Hey diddle diddle," with the infinitely more important "But dem never tell me about Nanny de Maroon." Nanny of the Maroons, also known as Queen Nanny and Granny Nanny, was born in about 1686 and led a community of formerly enslaved Africans called the Windward Maroons on the Caribbean island of Jamaica. Maroons were African slaves who had escaped and established communities in the mountains in the interior of Jamaica. Celebrated as a military strategist, she led a guerrilla war during the early 18th century against the British colonists. The Maroons believed that Nanny had supernatural powers which allowed them to be undefeated by the British, who eventually signed a peace treaty with them, granting the Windward Maroons freedom and 500 acres of land. She was declared Jamaica's only female national hero in 1975. Agard uses a compound adjective to describe her. She was a seafar woman, or a visionary. This description perhaps also alluding to her alleged supernatural powers as well as her cunning as a military strategist. The image is all the more powerful for the simplicity of the two combined words, which allow multiple interpretations. The phrase "mountain dream" is very probably a reference to the establishment of the free communities away from British colonial rule. Agard then uses a kenning to describe her, firewoman. A kenning is a two-word phrase used in place of a one-word noun that has a metaphorical meaning. Although modern writers have experimented with them, most notably Seamus Heaney, they are more usually to be found in Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon poetry, which perhaps suggests something almost mythical about her. The conjunction of fire with woman evokes both her bravery and ferocity, and the word struggle suggests her determination and persistence. The metaphor "hopeful stream to freedom river" suggests that the actions of an individual woman, as evoked by the word stream, and her hope for the future led to freedom for many, as evoked by the word river. Note the use of the natural imagery here, which suggests not only that Nanny was deeply connected with the land of her people, but also that she was a force of nature with which to be reckoned. The next two stanzas continue to list what he has been told and what he hasn't. He has been taught about the English Lord Nelson and his victory at Waterloo over Napoleon's armies in 1815, although not, if you recall, Toussaint Louverture's victory over the same. But he hasn't been told about Shaka, the great Zulu, who was known as one of the most influential monarchs of the Zulu kingdom in South Africa. He may have been told about Columbus in 1492, but not what happened to the Caribs and the Arawaks too, as a consequence of this opening up of the continent to Europe. The Caribs and the Arawaks were indigenous peoples of the Caribbean who were either forced into slavery or died of diseases brought by the colonists that they didn't have the immunity to fight, or were slaughtered by them if they refused to surrender. The speaker goes on to say that he was taught about the English military nurse, Florence Nightingale and She Lamp, how the legendary figure of Robin Hood used to camp, and how old King Cole was a merry old soul, but dem never tell me about Mary Seacole. Mary Seacole, a contemporary of Florence Nightingale, was a British Jamaican nurse who provided food, shelter and nursing for wounded servicemen during the Crimean War in the middle of the 19th century. Note the way in which the first 4 lines of this stanza are very rhythmic. From Jamaica she travelled far, to the Crimean War she volunteered to go. While the fifth line, referring to the way in which the British refused to fund her work, and even when the British say no, sounds clumsy, perhaps indicating the way in which they hampered her. She was not to be deterred, however, as she still braved the Russian snow. The image of snow here can perhaps be taken metaphorically as well as literally, suggesting that she had to overcome many hardships to achieve her goals. She is described as a metaphorical healing star among the wounded, an association with light in much the same way as Florence Nightingale is associated with the light of her lamp. The light of a star, however, is natural, and its beams shine far further. The way in which she is also described metaphorically as a yellow sunrise to the dying suggests not only that her light shone all day and all night, but also the way in which she provided comfort and warmth and the hope, perhaps, of an afterlife to those fatally wounded. The final lines of the poem revisit the first. But now the speaker takes control, signalled by the coordinating conjunction but. He is now no longer a passive recipient of what others want him to know. He is checking out or investigating his own history, and in the process carving out his identity. The phrase carving out has connotations of something created and crafted with care and over time. There is also a sense of permanence in this image, as though, once he has it, it cannot be taken away from him. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques and English literature texts.